Joining us this evening in this joint hearing. To start it off, I want to ask the clerk to take rolls of the committee.
Senator Acosta.
Present.
Senator Cano.
Here.
Senator DiPalma.
Here.
Senator Felag.
Present.
Senator Murray.
Present.
Senator Paolino.
Here.
Chairman Pearson.
Here.
Senator Seveny.
Here. Here.
Senator Sosnowski.
Present.
Okay. That's 9 members on finance.
Senator Gordon.
Senator Rogers is here.
Senator Rogers is here.
Senator Coleman.
Here.
Senator Mack.
Present.
Senator Anderson.
Here.
Senator Picard.
Here.
Senator Gallo.
Here.
Senator Lombardo.
Here.
We have a quorum.
All right, thank you everybody, and glad for everyone to be here tonight, and excited to have both committees present for this important presentation. I want to ask all of our participants to remember to keep yourselves muted when you're not speaking so we can avoid any background noise. But want to start off by thanking again Chairman Lombardo and the Housing Committee for joining us this evening. The Finance Committee has had the opportunity to begin to really get a state of where we stand, especially with so much of the federal money that has come in. And one of the areas where there's just so much policy happening at once is absolutely in housing, and so we decided it would make a lot of sense to hold a separate hearing focusing on the housing response during the pandemic and some of the federal funds, and then also segueing into sort of longer housing policy and housing finance issues. And so it made perfect sense for us to do that as a joint committee with the Housing and Municipal Government Committee, and so I'm very excited to have everyone here this evening. Leading us through a series of updates this evening will be various members of the administration. We'll introduce them as they come through. But before I begin, Chairman Lombardo, any remarks that you want to do, or if you want to jump straight in?
No, first of all, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing the Housing Committee to participate in this event. It's very important. As we know, the Senate President has made housing a top priority in this year's session. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. With that, we're going to start off this evening with the Director of the Pandemic Recovery Office in the Office of Management and Budget, Jeremy Leach. Jeremy, I just want to say on behalf of, I know both committees and so many Rhode Island, thank you for all of your efforts and your work in responding to the pandemic. I know it's been a constant fire drill since you came back to state service. I want to thank you for coming back to state service, and thank you for all your work. I will turn over the initial part of the presentation to you.
Thank you, Chairman Pearson, for the kind words, and thank you both Chairman Pearson, Chairman Lombardo, and the members of the committees for the opportunity to present to you today. On behalf of the Executive Office of Commerce and Rhode Island Housing, we really appreciate the opportunity to delve into these important subjects with you. Can we get the slide deck up on the screen, please? Great, thank you. Can we advance to the next slide? So just briefly on the agenda, as Chairman Pearson noted, we'll start by diving in on the pandemic relief funding for housing-related initiatives. So we'll cover how we've been using federal funds and what federal funds have been available for these purposes. And then from there, we will transition to a broader discussion of housing policy and the housing bond process. So next slide, please. So first, we're going to start on the sort of federal landscape. And while the members of the committees will be very familiar with Rhode Island Housing and the Executive Office of Commerce, you may not all be familiar with the Pandemic Recovery Office within OMB, which is a new creature that was created in response to the pandemic. And I want to use this graphic as just a brief way to illustrate what the office does and what the high-level federal landscape has been. So Congress has enacted 5 major COVID relief bills to date. The first one was on March 6th, and as you can see, there was a period of relative intense activity in March and April. The largest and most prominent of those bills being the CARES Act, which we all know about, adopted in March of 2020. Then we had a long pause in congressional action until December 27th, when the most recent significant COVID relief bill was passed. And then we have the prospect of further COVID relief as the Biden administration has made that a priority, and the legislative process is working its way on Capitol Hill right now to address that. What I'm not showing on this timeline, because it would become the most complicated and busy slide you might ever see, is all of the different federal guidance and policy directives that have been issued by the federal agencies in response to these pieces of legislation. These pieces of legislation collectively provided substantial funds to states to assist in the pandemic response. And those funds broadly have come in 2 types. One was the extension of existing federal grant programs that routinely and periodically come to the state. In the CARES Act in particular, a number of programs were authorized to make supplemental COVID-specific grants within the contours of the existing programmatic structure. So that was one type of federal funds that was received. There's a second type of federal funds that have been received as a result of these statutes, and that's entirely new programs altogether. There have been a number of new programs that Congress has enacted that do not have the history of existing federal grant programs. The most prominent of those is the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which I'll talk about in a minute on the next slide, but there have been a number of programs like that. And all of those programs have had guidance and memos and sometimes changing guidance and changing rules from our federal partners. The third piece, which is not even pictured here, is also the reimbursement under FEMA, which is another substantial source of federal funding. And FEMA itself has had evolving guidance as the pandemic has gone on. So that landscape is why the Pandemic Recovery Office exists. It's our job to be monitoring all of these different federal programs and helping the Office of Management and Budget, the governor's office, and all of the state agencies manage and prioritize these multiple streams of federal funding, because there's a lot of different pools of money at play. And our goal is to help the state optimize the use of those funds to create the most value for the dollars we've received. So that's just a high-level overview of the work that we are trying to do. Next slide, please. So with that being said, I wanted to highlight on this slide the major sources of federal funding that can be used for housing-related costs. So the chart depicts 4 of those, and we're going to talk about all of these during the course of the hearing today. But again, I want to highlight what is noted at the top and not on the chart, which is that FEMA funding is a major source of funding, and FEMA funding works on a reimbursement basis where the state will apply to FEMA for costs that it has incurred. And there are various housing-related expenses that are FEMA eligible and that the state has relied upon FEMA to fund. So you don't see it broken out in the chart here, but that's an important source. Beyond that, you see the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which was established under the CARES Act and provided the state with $1.25 billion for all aspects of the pandemic relief, not just for housing. But I list it here because pandemic-related housing and homelessness costs are an eligible use under CRF, and it has been a primary funding source that we have used to date to address some of these needs. But it's not the only source that has been available to the state. So the next two grants, which we'll talk about in more detail later, the Emergency Solutions Grant and the Community Development Block Grant, these are existing grant programs that the federal government provides funds to the state periodically through these programs, but there were specific rounds of these programs dedicated to the COVID response that were enacted as part of the CARES Act. So these are also part of our response. And finally, the December 20th COVID relief bill. And unfortunately, I don't think a catchy nickname has caught on yet for what we call that bill. So I'm calling that the December 2020 COVID relief bill. That enacted an emergency rental assistance program administered by the U.S. Department of Treasury that is still being in the process of stood up by the U.S. Department of Treasury. And we will receive $200 million under that program. So that is less of a retrospective fund. That's more of a prospective fund to address housing-related needs. Next slide, please. So what we are showing on this slide is some of the primary federal pandemic-related housing spending that the state has engaged in to date using the federal resources that we have available to us. And this is a summary chart that provides you the high-level overview, and my colleagues from Rhode Island Housing and the Executive Office of Commerce will go into some detail on the various initiatives that you see pictured in this chart. But you can see what we had budgeted, what we have spent to date, and what we sort of expect to spend on the various initiatives that you see addressed here. I don't want to go into too much detail right now because I don't want to steal the thunder of my colleagues. So with the permission of the chairs, I would turn this over now to Christine Hunsinger from Rhode Island Housing, who's going to walk through some of the housing supply and rental support initiatives that you see listed here. She's going to provide more detail on how those programs operated and the outcomes they've achieved.
Thank you, Jeremy. And yes, Christine, welcome to Senate Finance. We're happy to have you here this evening to get into some more detail on the expense of these monies. So I think it's most appropriate that we'll continue with your presentation through slide 14, and then probably take a pause for questions from the committee.
Thank you, Chairman. So you can see on this slide the list of programs. My job is to walk you through in a little more detail each of these. So slide, please. And the next one. So the Landlord Incentive Program was administered by the United Way and the Rhode Island Coalition for the Homeless. And the idea behind it was to try to secure more apartments for those folks who were experiencing homelessness. In a housing market this tight, finding vacant, safe, and affordable apartments is tough. And so what we decided to do was to incentivize landlords to come into the program with a $2,000 bonus for the first unit and then $500 for each additional unit. We also had $2,000 available to landlords to make improvements on the apartments, to make them move-in ready and to do those small fixes that would bring it up to code. The program launched in June, and over the course of 5 months, we had 127 units pledged. Not all of them were good fits. Some were not vacant, and some needed much more repair than the $2,000 could provide. But over the course of the program, we were able to place 85 people in apartments. And many of those people were exiting what we call the shelter reduction program and had been experiencing homeless and then moved into a hotel temporarily. And this is just one tool that the state and its partners uses to help those experiencing homelessness transition to more permanent housing. And we hope to be able to restart this program shortly and continue on because it was very successful and pretty low cost. Slide, please. The housing acquisition program provided capital to developers to purchase properties that would immediately house people experiencing homelessness. Rhode Island Housing, in conjunction with the state, put out the RFP. 2 properties were purchased by developers, and they now house 44 people temporarily in shelter environments. The long-term plan for these properties is for them to turn into long-term supportive housing once the pandemic ends. So that was $1.6 million for those 2 properties. And the last program that I'm going to want to talk to you about is the state rental assistance program. And back when COVID first started, it's hard to remember because it's been a year now and we're used to the spikes and the restrictions and the shutdowns and things like that. But we didn't know anything. And so, we didn't know how any of the stuff would play out. And so the state shut down in mid-March and unemployment skyrocketed. And while we knew that would impact people and their ability to pay their rent and their housing payments, we didn't know exactly how it would play out. And what you can see on this slide is all of the, well, not all, but a lot of the programs that impacted renters that were put in place by the federal government and the state. So the federal government instituted supplemental or enhanced unemployment, and that provided an extra $600 a week to folks who were on unemployment. That allowed a lot of people to continue to make their rental payments. I just wanted you to be able to see all of the things that were in place that helped a lot of people be able to stay in their home, even though they were unemployed or there was that level of uncertainty. So while these things did help a lot of people, they weren't able to help everyone. And there was still kind of a great need for rental assistance. And the state stood up a program in May to address that need. And that program was met with some initial challenges. That rollout was very difficult. And I just want to highlight a couple of the difficulties that were experienced because I think it's going to be important for you to know what's required going forward when another program like this gets stood up. So technology was a big issue. We had multiple partners working on the program, trying to process applications, and no one partner had a system that was robust enough to support the number of applications or to allow the back-end processes to be done in an effective and efficient way. So technology was a big one. The other thing was the uncertainty and anxiety that I talked about earlier about what we didn't know. It drove people to apply for the program, even when they might not need it. That uncertainty, not knowing whether or not their job would last, drove them into the program, and they applied multiple times. And then what happened was their job didn't go away, or the unemployment allowed them to have the resources to pay their rent. But they had come into the program, and in conjunction with the technology that we didn't have, it became backlogged. And we had a bunch of people that we needed to reach. And because some people didn't need it anymore, they were harder to get in touch with and tell us they didn't need to. So the anxiety and the uncertainty was a key factor as well. But the biggest one that kind of caused problems in the program were the restrictions on the program and how you could use that money. What was required on the part of an applicant to demonstrate need. And so there were really, really onerous documentation requirements. Lots of people who were applying didn't have those. For example, at one point we required that you show us a lease, but lots of people don't have that. They're on a month-to-month. So the documentation was a big problem that caused the backlog and caused us to not be able to help some people. One of the other things that the program started out as was requiring that you demonstrate a direct link to COVID for income loss or job loss. And businesses shut down so fast that we weren't able to get that documentation easily, right? People would go weeks while they tried to contact their previous employer to provide that evidence. So really what caused so much of the problem was the rules that were in place. Okay, next slide. Here's where the story gets better. Over time, Treasury issued different guidances and updates to things, and other federal programs issued different ways that you were allowed to operate in those. And so we learned over time what we could and couldn't do. And so the partners were able to sit with the state and walk through some very key changes to make the process much simpler on the applicant and to make approval simpler on the staff that were processing those applications. And we did that while keeping safeguards in place so that we continue to be good stewards of federal dollars. Some of those changes were simple. We just combined everybody into one program. So you didn't have multiple places to go, so you didn't really apply more than once. All the rules were the same. So if you got accepted here, you weren't also trying to go into a different program because it was the same requirements. So that was one. We adopted a public health lens for program eligibility. So in the beginning, they required demonstration of a direct COVID link to job loss or income loss. But the state took the view that keeping people in their homes, keeping them from being homeless, keeping them from doubling up and living in crowded places or having to move to shelters and other congregate settings was in fact COVID related. It prevented or minimized the risk of exposure to the virus. And so that allowed more people to be eligible in the program. We were able to help a lot more people with that lens. We also switched based on some program rules at the federal level to a self-attestation of income and need. And so that allowed the person to come in and to tell you what their income was without us having to get 3 months of bank statements or other kinds of documentations from employers that were difficult to reach. And they did so under the pains and penalties of perjury, and were instructed that if it wasn't accurate and was found out, that we would try to get the money back and things like that. So that really sped things up. And so now the program's going pretty well. Next slide. So to date, we've gotten just over 9 million paid out in rental arrearages. We've been able to help over 2,300 people. We're still processing those applications. The program closed on December 30th so that we could wind down this program and assist the people who had come in, try to make sure that we have enough resources to help those people who are already in line. But we've been granted permission by the state to process those applications through the end of March. I think we'll be done a little bit sooner, but so we've got roughly $4.5 million still left to expend in assistance to renters. The next slide. I just thought the demographics would be interesting for you. So roughly 35% of assistance went to people who identify as a racial minority, 29% to those who identify as Hispanic or Latino, and 75% of the money went to female-headed households. So you can see that it's reaching a broad representation in the population. Next slide. On the right side, you can, well, I don't know, I'm not good with the Zoom thing, but you can see the breakdown by municipality over there where the help went. But I want to talk a little bit about the things that we did with some of the other funds that are mixed into that bigger number on the slide Jeremy had up. So we had partnerships with the Rhode Island Legal Services and the Center for Justice. So tenants that came in who were scheduled for eviction hearings or were having trouble negotiating with their landlord had legal representation. And what we know is that tenants that have legal representation fare much better in eviction proceedings. So that was a really key component. We also worked with those groups to mail everyone who had an eviction hearing or an eviction filed against them, worked to get the word out about the program to make it known that help was available. And then one of the things that we did that we found was really effective was set up in the courthouse. So Crossroads was our partner in that. They sat in the courthouse, and people who came in for an eviction hearing that was scheduled that hadn't that when the program was open that hadn't applied were able to apply right there. Usually the landlord or a representative was also there. And so the staff from Crossroads was able to talk to both of them and gather information. Sometimes all of the documentation was available from those two people, and the approval could be issued right on the spot. And if there was still documentation necessary, tenants could still take a letter into the court and say that they had just applied, they were in the process. And the court worked with us on a lot of those cases to give enough leeway for that application to be completed and then paid out. So that was a really effective component of the program. Next slide, I think.
And Chris, I think that's actually a good break point. So as we take a look at some of these, I think the important thing for our committees has been we want to take a look at kind of what was the effectiveness and what lessons can we learn from the money that we did receive previously and had administered previously. And so I think you certainly have given us a lot of information there. And then I think what the second intent is beginning to look on a forward-looking basis, right? As additional money comes into the state, what lessons can we learn from this? How can we work together to make sure that we appropriate the money to the programs that we know that work, that are effective, and that can be executed quickly within a lot of these federal deadlines. Could you just maybe give a sense, if you sort of take a look at the chart that was on slide 12 on that ramp up, you can really see that the money really didn't start moving out the door until September. Is that when we really started being in the courts and really trying to that, the trend line prior to that, the pandemic, began in March or so, and a lot of this money was a bit earlier, but you really see that money ramping out on the second part of the year. Can you maybe give a little bit of insight as to what was that big spike and how we drove that, how we identified that much need and drove it out that quickly?
Yeah, so we sat with the state in late October, and the first week that the new changes were in place is the week of November 1st. So you can really see how those changes took effect. It ramps up even there because we had to train staff. We had to learn how to do a new process. We had to update the little technology we had, update the forms and things like that. But once we were able to implement all those changes, it really ramped up. We also did a few other things where we tried to reach out to larger groups. So on the affordable housing side, in those developments, those folks were already income qualified, right? So we knew that they met the income eligibility threshold. We worked with landlords and those tenants, and the landlords brought all of their tenants who were behind in a batch. So we were able to process, where one day we would have processed 50 applications going individual by individual, we were able to really increase that number because a whole batch of anywhere from 4, smaller development to, 75 and a larger one were brought in, were evaluated, approved, and so that you see some of that there. We also did reach out to the lawyers who handle the majority of evictions. There's like 8 or 9 of them in the state that do like 85% of them. And we reached out to them. Some of those lawyers gave us their list of people that they were filing against, and we were able to kind of work through those. So we really, as we worked the program changes, really stepped back and tried to figure out how we could reach lots of people in simpler ways.
Thank you so much. For the members of the committee, if you do have a question, if you can text it, just text me and let me know that you do have a question. That's probably the easiest thing. I can't quite see every member on the screen here. Our first question from Senator Paolino.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Christine, for walking us through this slideshow. I'm looking at slide 5. That's where my question is. And I'm looking at the availability date. Obviously, the first 3 are from the CARES Act, and then the December 20th COVID relief bill. Why are the availability dates so far out from now? It seems like we could use this assistance sooner than later.
On the first 3?
On all of them, actually.
I'm going to have Jeremy speak to this because he's much better at speaking OMB than I am, and I'm not familiar with all of these. So maybe Jeremy could answer this question.
Thank you. Great.
Sure. Senator, that's a great question. The availability date, what we mean by that is that's sort of when the clock runs out on the money. You know, you basically have to obligate it, or you have to spend it or obligate it by that date. It's a little bit different depending on the federal program. And as you can see from this chart, each program just has a separate set of rules with respect to the date when time runs out. I'll note in particular, you know, on the Coronavirus Relief Fund, it was on December 27th of 2020 that the feds extended the date by a year. So it's just it's a complicated, sometimes changing landscape, but we try to be mindful of it as we prioritize which funds to use when.
Okay, fantastic. That makes this much better. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Senator Cano.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Then thank you, Christine, for going again through all these slides. This is great information. My question is in relation to the eligibility of the rental assistance program. I wonder if you have any data of how many undocumented Rhode Islanders were able to get assistance program from this fund.
Yeah, I don't have it because we don't ask the question. We work with every tenant who comes in to meet the documentation requirements. We offer a variety of ways of showing residency and verifying that. And so we don't have that information because we don't ask the question. We find that it's off-putting.
Which is great. And to that point, I think that one of the things that you mentioned on the eligibility was the fact that a lot of people couldn't get this help because of the lack of the lease or documentation. So are you planning of doing something different for eligibility for the new funds coming in, just to make sure that that lack of information allowed more Rhode Islanders to qualify for the program? Because we all know there's a need, and the need is greater than probably the amount of applications that you receive.
Yeah, and so when we made those program changes, we came up with a list of things you could provide to demonstrate income or demonstrate residency. We, you know, if you provided an attestation that you live there, if you could show a utility bill, and your landlord confirmed that you lived there and could show any kind of communication. So we really opened it up. We required that people demonstrate it, but we didn't, to the extent that we could be flexible on how they demonstrated it, we did.
Perfect. And just the last question I have is, what non-corona relief fund, like, you know, federal funded rental assistance, housing, or homeless funding did Rhode Island receive? Was there any assistance for the individuals with developmental disabilities?
So I can't speak to that. I was not involved in programs that specifically did that, but maybe one of my colleagues. And if they can't, we can find out for you and get back.
That would be great. You don't have to answer today, but if we can find out that information, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Senator DiPalma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Christina, thank you. We know what we know based on what we've done over the last number of months. We expect there's money going forward for rental assistance. And I asked, think about this question in a larger context. Having spent a fair amount of time of looking at funding that was made available for small businesses in Rhode Island, every state did something different. And we did something, then we changed it, we modified it, made it better, did whatever. But it wasn't I don't want to say a whack-a-mole kind of approach in some areas, but in some areas it was. From a housing, I'm not saying that's from a housing perspective, what kind of conversations have been had with your colleagues across the country that are all doing this at exactly the same time, so that you indicated we're creating a new program? So if we created a new program, one would hope, or maybe expect, I'm not sure what the right word is, that another state's already done that. So the question is, are there regular sessions you might have with your counterparts across the country that are doing the exact same thing we do? And there are regions, I would suspect, across the country that look just like Rhode Island, obviously in a much smaller context. So are we doing that? Will we be doing that? How do we ensure we do that to learn what they've learned already instead of having to learn it again?
Yeah, we have a really strong network with the other HFAs throughout the country, and NCSHA, which is a group that we belong to, has message boards and conferences and things like that. And we didn't wait until now. All along the way, we contacted our counterparts to find out what were they doing, were they having any success, and was it something we could incorporate. I will tell you that the story of the difficulties that Rhode Island had are not unique. States throughout the country had a lot of trouble getting the rental assistance money out until we all learned the lessons we did, right? And so that was ongoing. We have continued to reach out to them in anticipation of there being a new program to understand all the different pieces that proved successful. So we have a list of technology platforms that other states use that they really like, and we've talked to them about why they like them. We had a great big meeting when there was talk of this money being approved prior to it being approved to talk about what we needed from Treasury to make it successful. So that process is ongoing. Probably a week doesn't go by without us talking to somebody else somewhere else looking for the magic that they may have already discovered that we haven't, and sharing the lessons we learned. So I think throughout the country, you'll find that states are much more prepared to know what will make a program successful, assuming that the rules that the federal government hands down allow that, right? So you have to wait for what they say is allowable.
Christine, thank you. And I suspect you've helped and assisted folks in all 39 cities in town. So thank you for what you've done. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Mack.
Hi, thank you all for this presentation. I had a couple of questions, particularly because we know homelessness was a problem before the pandemic, and rising rent costs were also a prohibitive factor for people being able to secure and have housing stability in Providence. What are the plans going forward to address some of the root causes of homelessness and rising rent costs in the city, so that when we are in a post-pandemic world, we are still not seeing folks 30 days, 90 days, 120 days, or 6 months after the end of the pandemic, whenever that is, face homelessness and eviction as a result of other systemic issues that existed prior to the pandemic.
So I worked a little bit on some of the homeless programs that we stood up, the shelter reduction program, but I'm going to defer to my colleague Mike Chandra, and I think if you wait a little bit, they're going to talk about efforts that were already done around homelessness, and that would probably be a place for them to tell you what they've got planned going forward. But it's not my area of expertise, so.
We can certainly come back to it, Senator, when we get to that section, if that's okay.
No worries, thank you.
Okay. Senator Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Christine, for your presentation so far. I had two questions. One's a bit related to what Senator Gallo was saying, and it's, really from what we've learned so far in lowering the barriers to access to some of these resources, what do we plan on codifying going forward? Not just for this money, but for the way that we think about housing and rental assistance and evictions more broadly in the state of Rhode Island. And then the second question is really, are we paying rent or are we paying mortgages? And I suspect that we're paying the former, but I think that if we were paying the latter, we would be saving money and being able to support more families around the state. And so is there a way to get it so that we're not just propping up the profit of landlords to continue during the pandemic, but rather saying, hey, we're not going to let your property get foreclosed on, but we're also not going to, pay you through the same profit margins that you were making before this, because it just costs us more money and we're able to help less people.
Yep. So as to what we're going to codify, I just point you back to what I said earlier, that really what we're allowed to do and the flexibility that we can exercise in a new program is going to depend on what the federal government allows. And under the Trump administration, they issued a first round of guidance, but we understand that there'll be a second round, and we're hoping that that will allow more flexibility, because the first round wasn't great. It's very restricted. So that's, I think if we were allowed the flexibility to incorporate all the lessons we learned, we would. Part of one of the programs, I talk about rental assistance now as all one program, because we combine them all together. But the point of one of the programs, the Safe Harbor program, was as an eviction diversion program. And for a long time, it had a component where part of what happened was negotiating with landlords to maybe take fewer dollars. So to your point about profit or spreading the money further, that proved to be, and some of it was because of the technology and all of the things I mentioned that were just problematic, but that proved to be tough. It proved to be cumbersome. And there was nothing that required a landlord to participate. So a landlord could refuse, and then the tenant was kind of out of luck. So we did away with that so that we could help tenants, because it was really troubling to us where we could have provided the rent, but the landlord didn't have to participate. So I think on that, there's a conversation to be had about what it looks like going forward. But that was our experience to date around that. Did I answer your question?
Yes, and thank you. And also, not surprising that would have been the way they responded, but thanks.
Not all of them. I'll tell you, we ran into the full gamut of humanity in this program. There were landlords who waited and waited and worked with us. So it's not everybody. I mean, like I said, we encountered all of humanity in this program, from really, really wonderful people to not great.
Thank you very much, Christine. Your presentation has been very informative. I have one quick question. Are we tracing this money? Do we know that the tenant is paying the landlord? Is there a way to trace that money, my question?
So in this program, we required the landlord to participate, right? Which goes to my previous, and we paid those funds directly to the landlord. Under the guidance and how the program was structured, we did not feel as though we had the leeway to provide the money directly to the tenant. So so we know where it went. It went to landlords who had come in and said that this was for rent. I will say that part of the program required that once you took the funds for the back rent, that you did provide 3 months forward-facing eviction protection. We urged tenants to pay their rent if they could. But once the landlord was made whole on the arrearage, that landlord could not evict someone for 3 months, even if they didn't pay their rent. So maybe that's part of the answer to the previous question, but we know it went to the landlords for rent.
Thank you. Senator Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first and foremost, I want to just thank you for all the work that you've done thus far, particularly being proactive in the courts. I just think that's just really valuable work. And I know that you have been very active up here in Woonsocket, so thank you for that. You stated that 2,300 people or 2,300 approximate families we have helped so far, and that you're continuing to process those applications. Mm-hmm. The cap for assistance is, am I correct that it's $5,000 per family?
So it used to be, as part of the program changes, we removed the cap because we were getting further and further into the pandemic, and more people had been out of work for longer, and the rent, it just kept going up. So we removed the cap. We are able to pay, we were able to pay back rent for as many months back to March. So our requirement of the program at the federal level was that it be pandemic related. So once the pandemic started, we were able to, and in some instances did, pay right through the entire period.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Do you have any idea how many eligible Rhode Islanders did not receive assistance and failed to be able to pay rent? Do we have any numbers on that?
Yeah, so it's really hard to get there, but I think I understand what you're asking. So for a period of time, the courts were closed and evictions couldn't happen. Legal evictions couldn't happen. I can't really speak to the self-help ones. They're illegal and they happen kind of under the radar. But so the courts were closed for a while, and then once they opened back up, they had limited capacity. So I think what we've seen since the courts reopened in June is that evictions are down from last year, year over year, about 40% on the for lack of payment. So for other reasons, in violation of the lease, or the lease is up and someone doesn't want to continue to rent, those have kind of steadily come back up to the typical level. But so we know that fewer people have been evicted this year than tend to be in a typical year. I can't really, because of the issues that we experienced with the program, I can't really tell you how many people needed help but didn't get it. What we found in our program and what we found throughout the country was that there's a very high rate of ghosting. So someone comes in and applies because they're afraid that they might lose their job this week, but then they didn't. And so when we call them back, they don't need us anymore. And no one really answers their phone because of the spam, and no one clicks on a link in an email because of the spam. And so it's become very difficult. That was also one of the lessons learned. We found that texting is a good way, but it's really hard. I'm sure that there were people who were eligible, whose landlord would have participated. That time just ran out and didn't get help, but I can't quantify it for you.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I imagine that's really hard to quantify, but I felt like that was a question that needed to be asked. But again, I just want to thank you for your work. It's very much appreciated, and hopefully we will get some more relief very soon.
Thank you, Senator. It looks like this is a good point to move on to the next section.
I just did have one quick question.
I'm sorry, Senator Rogers.
I do have, there was very interesting questions that came up, and I have one. Like, when these people come in and apply for rental assistance, I know there was a lot of people unemployed, and I also know there were a lot of people unemployed that were getting their unemployment benefits and an additional $600. In reality, many people were actually taking home more money being unemployed because of that extra $600. And when we handed out this rental assistance, I know we didn't ask the citizen statusship, but were we asking questions to see were they actually not paying their rent but still receiving unemployment in addition to more money than they were with the 600? Were those questions asked? Because the other side of this story is the landlords too have commitments and have to pay, and if they're being treated unfairly, a house that's rented for $1,200 is $3,600, and they owe the bank penalties and everything else. And we always talk about one side of this story, so I just want to make sure that there's a limited amount of money that goes out, and if we don't tighten them parameters up, there's other people that get damaged in that carnage. So was that done when this money was handed out?
Yeah. So the program from the federal guidance capped eligibility at 80% of area median income. And I've always sworn that I won't do math out loud in front of the legislature or the press. So I can't tell you what that dollar amount is, but I could get it for you later. So if you were receiving unemployment, but your income was below 80% at or below 80% of area median income, you were still eligible for rental assistance. Now, you had to demonstrate that you had a need. You had to demonstrate that you were behind on your rent. But that was the eligibility, the requirement.
So just to be clear, some people could have been making more money, not working, collecting unemployment with the additional and still qualified and said they can't pay the rent and would receive the money even though they were actually making more.
Yeah, out of the many people who came through the program, I'm sure that there were at least a handful that did that.
I just thank you very much. It's a very interesting answer.
Thank you, Senator. And as I think a transition, and Jeremy, keep me honest here, but at the end of the day, cumulatively through the end of January under the program, we've been able to identify and distribute for about $9 million of need in this area. That may be an interesting segue to the next section, where the state has $200 million coming in for largely a lot of the same reasons. So Jeremy, do you want to maybe just bring us through that allocation and what it can be used for?
Sure, I'm happy to do that, Chair. I do want to note, though, that we do project, I think it's 13.8 or 13.9 million will be where we land when we finish processing the applications that were received through December 30th, just for completeness sake. Can we go to advance to slide 15, I believe? So the COVID relief bill passed in December enacted a emergency rental assistance program administered by U.S. Treasury. And that program provides a minimum of at least $200 million to every state. And we received that threshold minimum of $200 million. And unlike the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which had a lot of flexibility that the state could use in determining eligibility and uses of the funds, this program that was enacted in December has some very specific guidelines that have been enacted into statute. And I won't cover all of them today, but on this slide 15, you can see some of the highlights. So the statute specifies who is eligible. And to be eligible, you need to be at 80% or lower of area median income. You need to be a renter. This is not eligible for mortgage assistance to homeowners. You need to have had a COVID-related financial hardship. So that could be you were unemployed or lost income or experienced additional costs. And you need to be at the risk of experiencing homelessness. So we don't have the flexibility to change those rules. Those are set in law. Likewise, the uses of the funds are set in law. And you can address rent or rental arrears, generally at most for 12 months, but in exceptional cases, 15 months. To your point, Chair Pearson, there is a different component here. You can also add utility or home energy costs, or arrears for utility or home energy costs. And that was not something we covered in our rental relief programs that Christine talked to you through. So that's a new component. And finally, there is a catch-all for other housing expenses resulting from the pandemic. But those have to be defined by U.S. Treasury, and they have not defined those yet. So there could be another set of expenses we could cover. And importantly, this money needs to be used between now and December 31st. And the U.S. Treasury is authorized to recoup funds that are not obligated starting at the end of September. So there is a time element here to getting this money out on the street efficiently and quickly. Turn to the next slide, please.
Jeremy, while you're actually on that slide on 15, as we look at the eligible households,
yes, sure.
The 4 bullets there, I assume
Yes.
they're in the federal statute that passed, or they're paraphrased from that statute?
These are paraphrasing the 4 eligibility requirements directly from the statute, yes.
And should I read them as an and, right? So families whose income below 80% and an obligation to pay rent and a household member and?
You have to check all 4 boxes.
All 4 boxes.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Go ahead to your slide.
So I think that transitions well, Mr. Chairman, to the next slide on 16, where you have the law, but then you also have the interpretation of the law, which is done by the U.S. Treasury in this instance. And on January 19th, the next to last day of the Trump administration, they put out FAQs interpreting some of the key open issues under the statute. And then very soon thereafter, the Biden administration has said, these FAQs are being revised and there will be new guidance forthcoming. We don't have that yet. So the bottom line is we are operating in a state of uncertainty at this present moment. But I do want to touch upon these questions because they address exactly what Christine was talking about, and they're very important to the ability to operate the program efficiently and effectively. So, big question, what documentation is required to establish income? The January 19th FAQs basically said you needed a wage statement, a tax return, something along those lines. They ruled out self-attestation, which we had been relying on. It is unclear what position the new administration will take, the new federal administration, that is. Likewise, what documentation is necessary to establish the reduction in income or a financial hardship? The FAQs are a little bit ambiguous. They seem to rule out self-attestation and just sort of said, you need documentation, but didn't specify what that would look like. Again, we don't know what position the Biden administration will take at this point. Another big question is, as I alluded to on the previous slide, in addition to rent and utility costs, you can also do other expenses related to housing. The January 19th FAQs did not even attempt to define what those other expenses would be, and we're waiting on the Biden administration's position. So those are just some of the interpretive questions. They're not the only ones. But these are very important ones that will determine the course of the program. Next slide, please.
Hey, Jeremy, on that, just as we think through this, right? So, if the household meets the all four criteria, and we start thinking about rent, utility costs, et cetera, and I'm seeing here, for at most of 12 months, and it says cost or cost in arrears. Do we think that it would be able to be used to, even if somebody did meet the qualifications of the four ands and they still paid their rent and they still paid their utilities, that they would be eligible for support even if they weren't in arrears?
Yes, actually, on that position, the Treasury took the position that there is no requirement in their FAQs. Let me just double check that. I believe that was the position they took. That there's no statutory requirement to demonstrate arrears. You still need to demonstrate a risk of homelessness, but not a demonstration of arrears. Yeah, that was their position they took.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. Slide 17, please. So I just want to point out that 10% of the $200 million we received can be used for housing stability services and program administration. Housing stability services need to be defined by Treasury, and they have not defined those yet. So that's another important interpretation issue that we are awaiting guidance on. And then program administration. I think Christine's presentation hopefully made clear to all of the members that these are complex programs to operate, and you really do need to invest in them to make sure they operate effectively, efficiently, and get the need where it needs to be while striking the balance of protecting taxpayer dollars. So that's going to be a substantial challenge. In addition, I just wanted to note that there will be detailed reporting required. So that's going to be part of the program administration. And likewise, the statute requires states and those administering these funds to have data privacy and security measures, given the types of data that will be received in the administration of this program. So those are some of the components that you have to be thinking about with program administration. And with that, and with an eye towards the success of this program, I did want to turn it over for the next slide to Carol Ventura, the Executive Director of Rhode Island Housing, to sort of sum up some of the key considerations that the state and its partners are thinking about right now. Are you there, Carol?
I am. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Great. Chairman Pearson, Chairman Lombardi, and committee members, I'd like to spend a few minutes discussing the additional $200 million in federal relief funding received by the state to assist Rhode Islanders with rental arrearages, utility and energy cost arrears, and other housing-related costs incurred because of the pandemic. As you've heard tonight, Rhode Island Housing has worked diligently over the past year with the United Way, Crossroads, and the Housing Network to administer the current rental assistance program. We see every day how much need exists for rental help, and this program really provided much-needed relief to many Rhode Islanders during the first phases of the pandemic. In conjunction with the state and our partners, we're evaluating right now the current rental assistance programs and what new programs need to be created to use the $200 million in funding in an effective and efficient manner. Incorporating those lessons learned, like we've talked about from our previous experience, is key to any new effort being successful. And the top three areas that we're focused on is technology, staffing, and flexibility. In terms of technology, my team has developed a list of key functions that will be necessary to create a successful program based upon our past experience and that of our partners in deploying the current funding. Many housing finance agencies like Rhode Island Housing have been charged with deploying the new funding. So as you've heard, we've reached out to sister agencies in other states to understand their experience with different technology platforms. In addition, the executive directors of the Housing Finance Agency have periodic calls to discuss what's working well in each state. We know that accessibility and automation has to be built into the new system in order to prevent the backlogs and to ensure Rhode Islanders are assisted quickly. We also know that ease of reporting will also be a critical component of any software that's ultimately used for the programs. We recently issued an RFP for a technology solution, and responses are due next week. Based on our research, we really feel confident that there are platforms out there that will provide a solid foundation to implement the new COVID program. Secondly, adequate staffing and appropriate staffing is a consideration. Having the right people in the right positions and having enough of them will be essential. This is a very large program with a significant amount of resources and currently a very tight timeline to get out the door. No single organization will be able to manage all aspects of it. It will take a broad array of partners providing a wide range of services to make sure we're communicating to people throughout the state, that we're able to assist applicants in a variety of languages, excuse me, and are meeting people where they are and providing the appropriate level of support. We're working to design a process that would bring partners to the table for their feedback and guidance on how to best implement programs, ensure that the programs meet the needs of all Rhode Islanders. Lastly, being flexible and being positioned to pivot will be critical. As you heard earlier, the changes made to the existing programs were what allowed the money to get out the door and into the hands of Rhode Islanders who needed it. The guidance issued by Treasury allowed us that flexibility. We were able to use a public health lens and keep people in their homes to reduce the risk of exposure to the virus rather than assist only those who were able to directly demonstrate a loss of a job or income due to COVID. We were able to accept a variety of documentation to determine eligibility and need, right? So you heard that we were able to come up with creative ways, creative documentation to ensure that applicants met the program requirements but provided the most flexibility to Rhode Islanders. Under the Trump administration, Treasury issued the first guidance on these new dollars, and currently it does not allow for that kind of flexibility. The current guidance is very restrictive, and a program run under these rules will look very different. We've been told and anticipate that new guidance will be released, and we're hopeful that changes will be made, but it's important to understand that what can be done with these resources is largely contingent on the rules of the federal government.
Yeah. So
We're
Carol,
committed to working with the state and our partners. And the good news is the Biden administration has extended the CDC eviction moratorium until March 31st, which affords a level of protection to those who are currently unable to pay their rent. When the program opens, when this program opens and we begin accepting applications, it's a function of how fast the technology and the partners can be in place. So work has been underway for well over a month now, and we're making every effort to ensure that these things happen as quickly as possible.
Yeah. So thank you, Carol. I guess my question would be, maybe for Jeremy as well, have we seen any indication from the Biden administration as to the timing to which they're hoping to issue the rules on this program?
Jeremy, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. I have not seen anything with precision, no. I think they know it's a priority, but I don't have a date for you.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess Carol, I think everything I'm hearing you talk about there around laying the groundwork, this is going to be, obviously a very large dollar amount to get out to Rhode Islanders, and we want to make sure that we get out every possible dollar that we can under the law and under the rules, and it will be a very short window to execute that much money out directly to individuals. And so I hear your point there around, I heard you talking about the technology and the staffing, and I guess my question and kind of my hope is that we're already building, prototypes of different programs that we think may fit the rules that we could then tailor later if we needed to. But I guess my hope would be is that we're coming up with programs, trying to design technology to do it, and even if we've got to burn some money to reprogram with new rules, that we've got the infrastructure set up to get this money going as quickly as possible.
Yes, certainly, Senator, and we are building the plane as we're flying it. So on the ground with our partners, designing what's going to be needed moving forward.
Okay. And could you, so based on the parameters that you're aware of today, as a follow-up, would you be able to share with the committee the parameters of perhaps some of the prototype programs that you're thinking about? I think one of the things that our committee would like to have ability to is to provide input as these programs are created versus only getting a view after the fact.
Sure, we can certainly share with you outlines of where we think the program should go and what they should look like. We can certainly share that with the committee members.
Okay. That would be great. Thank you. Senator Paolino.
Well,
thank you, Chairman. Jeremy, if we can just go back to slide 15 for 1 second. You mentioned area income. Can you just give me some insight onto how many area incomes there are in Rhode Island and maybe a range of the highest and lowest amounts of that?
Senator, I don't have that at my fingertips, but we can get back to you on that. I don't know if anyone from Rhode Island Housing has that, since we were using a similar threshold for the card program. But if they don't, we'll get that to you.
Yeah, I would like to see that. I'm just curious how that's calculated. And then you may have covered this, I might have missed it, but are there any other expenses that are covered by the rental assistance, aside from rent?
So as you see on this slide here, there are 3 categories: rent or rental arrears, utility or home energy costs, or arrears for utility or home energy costs.
Okay, perfect.
And then a 3rd category of housing expenses that remains to be defined by U.S. Treasury.
Okay, thank you very much.
Senator Mack.
Thank you, Chairman. I had another question also geared towards folks who are experiencing homelessness and not just on the brink of eviction. Is there any way or any plan for Rhode Island to start looking at ways for people who are experiencing homelessness to access these rental assistance programs? And what would that look like?
So with respect to this particular program, Senator Mack, if you see on this slide, a statutory requirement is that the applicant have an obligation to pay rent. So that does present somewhat of a barrier for persons who are already homeless. But I think this is an area where we would want to seek or hope for flexibility, either in housing stability services, which is another eligible use of funds, but not yet defined by the federal government, or perhaps using other sources of federal funding to address that.
Senator DiPalma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Jeremy, I'd ask that as we move forward, before we start any new program or whatever it is, and we saw this as it relates to the previous hearing with Director Womer from OMB on the 20 different categories of, I think it was 20 different categories of funding that were provided as part of CRF dollars, et cetera. Now, before we give out $1, we have the way to report what we've given out, and whatever the reporting mechanisms are, I'll say almost on a moment's notice. I know the challenge we've experienced to date, every time we've asked for a update across the 20 categories, all 20 categories already exist in the beginning. It's taken a significant amount of time to do that because of our financial system, how things were structured, et cetera. So before we move forward, either whether it's here, Rhode Island Housing, or wherever, we have a means to report should our constituents ask us, you received $200 million, how much has been spent, where is it going, where has it gone, et cetera. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator DiPalma. I think that is a very important issue. I believe I've talked to Carol about it. I think she agrees that having good access to timely data on the progress of this program will be very important.
And the last piece, from a transparency perspective, for any of the 1,050,000 constituents out there that want to know and appreciate where it is, they may not have to like it, but at least we'll be able to share with them and say, here it is, if you want to go see it, give us some feedback, as opposed to, well, we haven't gotten it yet, we'll get it to you in a little while. So, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Jeremy. It looks like that wraps up the questions we have on that section, unless any senator didn't text me. Okay. I believe at this point we're going to turn over to Hannah Moore. Hannah, welcome to the Senate Finance.
Thank you very much, Chair. I do believe that Mike Tondra was planning to present these slides before I get started. I'm happy to tag team it with you, Mike, but and I think Senator Mack, a lot of these slides will get to some of your questions about homelessness. So, all right, Mike, do you want to share if you will, Mike?
Yes, thank you, Hannah. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Chairman Pearson, Chairman Lombardo, and members of the committee. If you can advance the slide, please. Very early in this crisis, there was recognition that the homeless population were particularly vulnerable to infection, in part because of underlying health conditions and disabilities, but also because of their living situations, very often in congregate settings or living in the street or other places not meant for human habitation. So in response to that, a homeless task force was established to really assess what needs are out there and to develop actions and implement actions quickly to address those needs. Some of the things that were done is we established sanitation stations throughout the state. These were hand washing stations and porta potties available to people who may be unsheltered and really no longer able to access sanitation areas because public buildings and businesses and the such were closed. Those have continued operation to this day. Also, very early on was establishment of a quarantine and isolation site for persons experiencing homelessness who tested positive or who were symptomatic and awaiting their test results. And the reason for this was, of course, logical to assure that they had limited interaction with other folks and thereby reducing the spread of the infection. We also implemented cleaning services initiatives centralized through the Rhode Island Coalition the Homeless, which was available to a number of shelter environments throughout the state so that if they did have an individual who tested positive, that professional entity could come in and clean those common spaces and areas to assure that they were safe for the other residents. We also did some rapid deployment of supplemental awards for shelters to just purchase things that are probably quite obvious, like increased supplies, personal protection equipment, expanded food and services, because as some of the populations were now not leaving during the day and going elsewhere, they were trying to shelter in place. And that, of course, had increased cost to the programs that we were attempting to cover. Some other initiatives that we did do have already been covered by Christine, and in the presentation you've heard before me, which included the establishment of the Landlord Incentive Program, which was encouraging landlords to rent to folks that had perhaps a history of housing instability and were currently experiencing homelessness. Some of those folks had rental assistance, but merely could not even find units in which to use those vouchers. We also expanded hotel motel voucher programs I'll talk about that in just a moment, and through a few initiatives called the Shelter Reduction Program, also to be referenced in the next slide. But before I move on, I would like to address the question that was raised by Senator Mack. As we kind of worked through and addressed many of these immediate needs for this population, we have simultaneously been looking at the causes of homelessness and trying to address those to prevent an inflow of homelessness into our system with potential reductions in income and people unable to pay their rent or utilities. We saw that that could be a challenge, and an already overburdened system might not be able to accommodate that increased need. So some of those identified challenges were addressed through establishment of rental assistance and other programs, but we're always looking to prevention to assure that's looked at, that we're looking at those root causes. But really, when you look at the fundamental root cause of homelessness, it comes down to the lack of adequate permanent housing with necessary supports. And some of what is being proposed that we'll be talking about in a little bit is really addressing that and attempting to increase the supply of affordable housing throughout our state, which will, of course, we hope address the particularly vulnerable population of the homeless. Next slide, please. So I skipped over some of these temporary shelter reduction programs that were established, so I'll just talk about them briefly. The quarantine isolation housing utilized a hotel site in Warwick, and it was, as I mentioned, specifically for persons that were positive or asymptomatic and awaiting the test results. This program was principally FEMA supported. Formerly, there was a 75% reimbursement rate that may be changing with the new administration. However, in either case, there is a need for the state to supplement some cost associated with this program, because there are some services and some costs that are not reimbursable by FEMA. So we did incorporate into this program case management and a concentrated health services for the population that were there to assure that their needs were adequately met. In addition to that quarantine and isolation site, there were also shelter reduction programs established. There was actually two. One that was initially established, then sunset sometime over the summer, and then a second one that it was initiated at the beginning of the winter, harsh winter months. So these were set up because of CDC and Department of Health recommendations on social distancing. Some of the shelters had to actually reduce their capacity. They had to space out the folks that they serve appropriately. And because of that, our system was not really able to accommodate all the folks that were experiencing homelessness. So the first time in, this shelter reduction program provided a short-term alternative for folks to remain sheltered in these hotel sites. And there was concentrated services incorporated into these programs to assure that the folks would be discharged to a more suitable permanent housing or stable shelter environment. In the winter months, it became that we had to reactivate that, because not only did we still have that same situation with shelters with reduced capacity, but we have a number of folks that were identified as living in the streets that could no longer do that during the winter months. In typical winters, those folks are sometimes able to come indoors, and shelters would sometimes use their community room space or really push their limits to assure that everybody had a safe roof over their head. But because of social distancing, they were not able to do that this year. So we have reactivated those hotel sites. Currently, the hotel has a program which is being managed by the Rhode Island Coalition for the Homeless, has a total of 200 rooms serving about 279 persons. And similar to the prior shelter reduction program, the objective and end goal of this is to ensure that folks that are being discharged from this program are, to the maximum extent practical, discharged to permanent housing environments as opposed to going back into shelter. Next slide, please. So one of the programs that the state did receive to specifically address the needs of persons experiencing homelessness is the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. This was one that was in Jeremy's earliest slides. This is an annual program that the state receives resources under, as well as several cities. But all of us received supplemental allocations specifically related to COVID. We have traditionally all worked together in the distribution of those fundings, and we continued that partnership for COVID resources. So we're working with Providence and Pawtucket in allocation of the needs in their funding. We conducted an RFP to identify what the best uses for these funds, and ultimately funded 10 agencies for a total of 25 programs. A large portion of them were for shelter and client service increases for many of the reasons that I've talked about, that many of the programs needed to add food to their budget, which wasn't a traditional cost, or add shelter time because they now operated on a 24-hour basis. We expanded that shelter cleaning, not expanded, excuse me, we continued the shelter cleaning and supplies efforts that were previously already started, and also have implemented a rental assistance program. Now that the two ways we have done this is both through prevention, but also through rapid rehousing. What that is more of a forward-facing rental assistance for folks that are already experiencing homelessness. We've done some other services such as street outreach, and some systems investments. Some of the systems investments go back to some of the questions that were raised about whether or not we're collecting data and we're doing effective planning for populations. Those were some of the minor investments that were made there to assure that we could meet some of the subpopulation needs like youth. Next slide, please. So another program, in addition to those, was the Community Development Block Grant Program. That program is one that we've been working on. The resources have not yet gone out. We have been focusing because, as you remember from the very earliest slides, you may have noticed that the deadline for the use of CDBG funds is 3 to 6 years out. And so the focus was really on a use of CRF funding, which had until late December 30th deadline. So many of the needs that were being identified in some of our outreach on CDBG were being addressed by another source. We have, however, used this period to really consult with stakeholder groups, whether that be homeless agencies and populations, other state offices and our colleagues in other states, as well as the public, and really identifying what are the best uses for CDBG going forward. In some instances, that funds may be used to continue efforts that have been initiated with other sources but have proven effective and which resources no longer are available. But there are several categories that I've listed here that I'll just briefly touch upon. Housing is being one. As I mentioned, we have a need for increased supply and permanent affordable housing. We have, at this point, committed nearly all of the prior affordable housing bonds, and we need to continue development to assure that we can find units. So we want to put some money out there for just that purpose. In addition, basic needs and addressing that. There's something that we've consistently heard when we went out to communities was to really provide services and facilities, particularly for highly vulnerable populations that include the homeless, but it may also include the elderly, the disabled, or it may be priority activities such as job training or certain health services. So all of these would be covered under this basic needs umbrella. These two categories have been an emphasis, and we have been working with the Office of Management Budget and have preliminary governance approval to move forward on the RFPs. We anticipate that the housing in RFP in particular will be dropping in just a couple days, and hope to see a good response to that. There are some of the other initiatives that we are working on, including broadband and connectivity for particularly low-mod income neighborhoods or for those households, as well as continuing some of the landlord incentive and homeless response efforts that may have been initiated with other sources. And then I did hear a reference to a question about assistance to homeowners and mortgage and not solely rental assistance. And that is something that we're working on with our colleagues at Rhode Island Housing to see if a program can be stand up to help folks that are in that situation. Next slide, please. Okay, before I pass on the torch to the next section, I do just want to reference that the total dollar amounts and the allocation of those fundings. I think that the earliest slide referenced that we have about $11.5 million in CDBG and 5.75 in ESG. Those allocations were made over multiple tranches of funding from HUD. And much like you've heard is a consistent theme throughout the presentation, we are somewhat building the plane as it flies. We got those allocations in some instances months before we had the guidance from HUD on how we can use those in the rules. So we are continuing to work within those to make sure that we're using the funds efficiently and effectively.
Thank you so much, Mike. Appreciate all of that information. Hannah, I'm going to have you jump right in to proceed on slide 25, I believe.
All right. Thank you so much, Chair Pearson and Chair Lombardo and committee members. I am cognizant that I am past the time frame that Senator Pearson aimed for us to be complete. So I will try my best to go quickly.
That's okay, Hannah. It wasn't you.
Well, great. It's there's so much work going on. It's really a lot. So thank you for letting us talk about this tonight. COVID has put tremendous strain on our housing system, and you've heard Chris and Jeremy and Mike talk and Carol talk about some of the work that we've done preventing evictions, helping people avail themselves of the CDC moratorium and rental assistance and getting access to legal assistance and on and on and on. But we had a very, very serious problem around housing affordability before COVID, and it makes the work that we're doing to address COVID even harder. And so before I go on, I do also just want to say there is a tremendous network of incredibly dedicated, passionate partners working on housing issues around the state, and I'm very, very grateful for everything that they're doing to help improve this. And if you'll go to the next slide, I'll keep going. To underscore the point about how serious the affordability challenges are, the National Association of Realtors has ranked Rhode Island one of the 5 least affordable states in the country. So it's like California, New York, Rhode Island, even more unaffordable than actually Massachusetts. The median sales price for a single-family home in Rhode Island increased 14% year over year. Multifamily home sales, 19%. And the availability of apartments, a year ago, I was comparing some notes from a year ago when we were talking with one of the committees, and a balanced homeownership market typically has 5 to 6 months of inventory. And last year, we were talking about 3 months. And this year, here we are, 1.4 months of supply. It is extraordinarily tight. And the rental market is also extremely tight. We have the second lowest rental vacancy rate in New England. And the average rents, even across even lower, smaller size units, is now above $1,200 for all unit sizes. So that is the context in which we're working. And the basic, one of the key reasons is that the supply is just not keeping up with the demand. And a lot of this comes down to not building enough. And you can see in this chart that it wasn't always like this, but we're building less than half of what we were in 2005. And this is market rate housing. Affordable housing is housing generally. And the state loses an estimated 500 units a year from demolition, deterioration. We have one of the oldest housing stocks in the country. So it's a big challenge, but I'll talk a little bit more next slide, if you don't mind, about kind of why this is. And there's a lot of reasons for the lack of housing production, including, we know construction costs are going up. We know developers have a hard time getting projects approved. We know, and you'll hear a little bit later when Mike and Carol talk about the housing bonds and all the elaborate work that goes into getting these projects financed. It's very challenging. But one thing I do also want to point out is that Rhode Island is investing far less in housing than our neighbors. So Massachusetts and Connecticut are investing 4.5 times, and this is per capita. This isn't just, we messed up and Mass is bigger. 4.5 times per capita than we are here in Rhode Island. Next slide, please. Historically, Rhode Island has relied very heavily on bonds to fund affordable housing development. And we're not the only one. Massachusetts put out a $1.8 billion bond in 2018. But and I'm going to talk in just a second about how important it is and how excited I am for the item 3 on the ballot for the new $65 million affordable housing bond. But we are the only state in the Northeast without a dedicated annual revenue for housing production. So for the housing bonds that we do, and we are very grateful for the resources to do what we're able to do, and Mike and Carol are going to talk more about all the work that they're doing to make the very most of it. But we do focus these resources on developing affordable housing. Typically, this looks like rental units that are up to 80% AMI, which actually, Senator, you asked earlier about the AMI. So it depends on the family size, or the number of people in a unit, but $62,000 a year is about 80% AMI for a family of 3. We also have done some ownership units for up to even 120% of AMI, which is about $90,000 per year for a family of 3. And there's a lot of focus also put on focusing on housing for the homeless, the elderly, veterans, and others with special needs. And next slide, please. So the $65 million bond, very excited. And this is a very significant step for Rhode Island to be investing. I've just explained we have a lot of catching up to do, a lot of projects that we hope will be built with this set of funds, and we are very eager to get moving on deploying these funds so we can start to build some really important and needed so much these units. So we're going to be meeting with the Housing Resources Commission later this month to begin planning for how we're going to deploy these funds. And I want to set the stage a little bit for what Mike and Carol are going to share in just a minute, to say that we do have challenges right now that we haven't had in earlier bond rounds, including a global pandemic that has stressed our housing system beyond anything we've experienced. And so that's one thing that I do think that we're going to grapple with, and I'm looking forward to absorbing from the housing partners on the Housing Resources Commission, how we can position these funds to respond to the moment that we're in right now. Also, creating permanent long-term supportive housing, which Mike alluded to, is such a fundamental component of, addressing homelessness, is a very significant challenge with subsidy dollars like these, because you also have to figure out how to pay for services. And so I think that's another thing that I'm looking forward to grappling with the team, is how, partnering with our sister agencies and all of our partners to figure out how we can use these funds to develop more long-term permanent supportive housing. And other opportunities for thinking about how we're going to deploy these funds include things like we've gone for several years without this level of investment. So there's an opportunity, and this is actually part of the reasons why a permanent funding stream is so important, is because you can develop some predictability in the market so that developers are thinking and planning for projects all the time. So we know we're going to have some work to do building the pipeline and partnering with municipalities to get these projects going. And there's many other things, and we're looking forward to getting this money out the door. Next slide. One other thing, and I just mentioned the pipeline. I do want to just call to folks' attention that there is an opportunity, a funding opportunity available right now for pre-development funding. And this can be from anything from doing a site survey to land assembly. And we know that this is such a fundamental contributor to the lack of supplies, the lack of starting early in the process, clearing the hurdles very early on. So applications are being accepted through March 17th, and we'll be very happy to talk more about this. The funds can also be used to help cities and towns improve their development process. So another opportunity. Next slide. And I do also want to call attention to a few of the proposals that were put forth in the budget last year to address some of these, to keep advancing these issues and chipping away at the obstacles where we can. So the first was proposing a dedicated funding stream for housing production. So funded by the more expensive home sales in Rhode Island, it was estimated to be $8 million per year. And this was proposed to be deployed towards more than just affordable housing, meaning deed-restricted affordable housing, but also generating that pipeline of projects and working with cities and towns, experimenting with other funding models, workforce housing. We know that the housing supply and demand challenges I've been alluding to affect Rhode Islanders across the income spectrum. And we very much hear from companies trying to attract workers, the housing issues they see are a very significant issue. So again, trying to build systems to address housing issues across the spectrum. The second proposal, partnering with cities and towns. We know that barriers to development exist often at the local level, and so we were proposing a model to work with cities and towns to identify where they could build new projects and making, and in some instances, removing the financial barriers to doing that. The last two items here, avoiding double taxation of affordable housing projects and strengthening housing governance. I mainly want to say that there is a lot of more work to do, and we're eager to continue it and partner with these committees and find ways to improve housing production here in Rhode Island so that we can keep Rhode Islanders able to afford their homes. So with that, I think that is my last slide.
Hannah, thank you very much. Certainly appreciate it. Hannah, I believe that Rhode Island is faced with a huge challenge with the lack of housing in the state, and it's something we need to attack sooner than later. And there's no better time than now with the extra money that we got coming into the state. Senator DiPalma, you have a question?
Mr. Chairman, I do, but I thought Hannah was going to address slide 32, so I'll wait until we get to slide 32. Sorry about that.
Not a problem, Senator. With that, we'll segue right into Carol or Mike to pick up the next section. So either one of you can jump in.
Actually, I think it's going to be both of us. I'll start off and then I'll be passing the presentation off to Carol. Today, we're really going to be providing you an overview of the state's prior affordable housing bonds. Those resources were distributed through a program known as the Building Homes Rhode Island program. Next slide, please. The state's Housing Resources Commission has really worked in partnership with Rhode Island Housing in the administration of BHRI, and this chart really depicts how projects move through the process from both commitment of the funds through the completion of the ultimate activities and development of those units. The left-hand side relates to Building Homes Rhode Island. The right-hand side is specific to a Rhode Island Housing more directly managed program known as the Acquisition and Revitalization Program, but they follow a similar process. The strengths of our respective agencies are really capitalized upon in that the HRC really serves as the planning and policy element of the BHRI program. We are responsible for developing the program regulations, for establishing the request for proposals, for reviewing those applications that are submitted, and ultimately allocating the awarded funds. While Rhode Island Housing, while they participate certainly in the review of application, particularly in the underwriting of proposals from a financial standpoint, they also handle the day-to-day management of the program once the projects are underway, and they will handle the construction, oversight of the construction, the disbursement of the funds to the developers, which is actually done on a reimbursement basis as the costs are incurred, and then also tracking the long-term affordability requirements associated with those units and to assure that they remain affordable for a long period of time. So the first step in this process, as I mentioned, is really the BHRI development of the policy and guidelines relative to that. With each bond issuance, we've had to promulgate or revise regulations that were in place, and I would anticipate the same would occur with the upcoming bond issuance that's under consideration by voters. If approved, we will already be underway in looking at what changes should be incorporated into the current regulations based on lessons learned. In fact, later this month, the HRC already has a scheduled meeting to start those discussions for consideration so that we can move as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. So we've had 3 affordable housing bonds that have been issued over time, and this just provides you a snapshot of those. And I'll just talk a little bit about the impact and outcomes of those prior affordable housing bonds. The first one was passed in 2006 and was $50 million for affordable housing production and preservation. The second one and that first one was generally presumed to operate over a 4-year period. The second one, which after a slight gap kicked in, was a $25 million bond, but it was of course similarly expected to only last a couple years, which led us to the most recent one, which is BHRI 3, approved by the voters in 2016. Now, this version of the affordable housing bond expanded eligibility quite a bit to really specifically call out preservation as a specific use, and also had a component for the revitalization of commercial and public spaces as well as residences. So, if you can advance the slide, please. So overall, these 3 bonds together Carol's going to go into more detail in each of the specific ones, but each of the bond issuance and their accomplishments, but they developed nearly 3,000 units overall and have certainly had substantial impact on the Rhode Island economy. About 60% of the funds have been used for development for new construction and new units, while a substantial portion of the funds, 40%, have been used for preservation. And that's to assure that when we don't have a net loss to our affordable housing units in our state, because existing ones may have been reached the end of their useful life. With a slight investment, we can in some cases preserve these projects and assure that they can continue viable in the going forward. It's important to note that for every dollar of bond funds that have been invested, $5.60 of other private and public sources have been brought in and leveraged. So overall, this accounts for about $660 million of additional investments, thanks to the BHRI contributions in these projects. And of course, there is a jobs and an economic benefit not only to providing housing for our workforce, but also in the activity itself of the construction, as there is an estimation that our activity has resulted in impacted approximately 4,000 jobs around the state. So with that, I'm trying to keep it succinct because I know we're running a little late, but I'll pass it off to Carol, who can kind of walk us through the outcomes of each of the bond issuance and talk about some of the challenges as well. Carol?
Thank you, Mike. Overall, BHRI projects have been extremely successful, with nearly all projects completed or on track for completion. More than 200 developments were financed through the bond. 9 developments have stalled or have been canceled, primarily due to an inability to secure the adequate funding needed from other sources or because of legal challenges to a project. In these cases, funds are deobligated and later reallocated to other projects approved under new funding rounds. Next slide, please. As of June 2015, all funds from BHRI 1 and BHRI 2, $75 million in total, have been committed to projects. As of January 2021, all funds for these developments have been dispersed. These funds are anticipated to produce nearly 2,000 affordable apartments and homes. Next slide, please. BHRI 3 has built on the success of previous bond rounds. The bond was fully committed in January 2020. However, 5 developments were unable to move forward in a timely fashion, and their funding was deobligated last month. Another funding round is planned in this first quarter to commit the remaining $5.9 million in funding. To date, over $33 million has been committed to develop or preserve 950 units. And Rhode Island Housing has dispersed $18 million. Most projects are still in development, and several projects from the most recent round are still finalizing their capital stack. Next slide, please. The Acquisition and Revitalization Program distributed $10 million for revitalization and blight remediation projects. Rhode Island Housing committed 100% of the funding as of June 2019. We anticipate that these funds will create over 150 residential units, 15 commercial spaces, and 7 public facilities. I want to bring your attention to the photo in the slide. This development involved the acquisition and rehab of a vacant commercial building in Central Falls, and this now houses a workforce training and educational hub for Rhode Island College. Next slide, please. I want to take a moment to describe the process of housing financing and development more broadly and walk you through the timeline of a typical affordable rental housing development. Ashton Village in Cumberland involved the redevelopment of vacant mill housing to create 53 affordable apartments, 3 of which were set aside for persons with disabilities. The project received a BHRI award of $1.9 million in 2013. but BHRI is only one of 10 different funding sources that finance this development, and this is typical for a rental project of this size. Developers apply for BHRI funds, but at the same time, they're working to secure funding from many other sources, each with different requirements and timelines. Next slide. In the case of Ashton Village, Valley Affordable Housing was the developer of the project, submitted an initial proposal to Rhode Island Housing in 2012 to secure low-income housing tax credits. So the low-income housing tax credit is our most oversubscribed resource to develop affordable rental housing. More often than not, developers must apply 2 or more times in order to secure a reservation of credit. So Valley Affordable Housing secured funding from 10 different sources over the course of about 2 years, with all funding secured by mid-2014. Keep in mind that funding is only one component of the deal. The developer also needs to apply for and receive permits from the town and other permitting agencies throughout this process. In the case of Ashton Village, it took nearly 2 years to receive all of the permits required to begin construction. It took about 2 years from the initial funding submission to Rhode Island Housing until closing on all of the financing. Construction began in 2014 and was completed in 2016. This example illustrates really how complex the development process can be. A delay in one of these many components can result in a corresponding delay in the closing of financing or the construction start date by several months or even longer. Let me pause here and so that we can respond to questions if you have any.
Carol, Mike, thank you very much. At this time, Senator DiPalma, followed by Senator Acosta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we go back to slide 32 for a minute? I have 2 questions. So, Carol, not this is for you or whomever. Based on the upcoming bond, well, let's assume it's going to pass. I hope it does, and I'm working to make certain it does on March 2nd. How should we expect the dollars will be allocated to the left side and the right side of the picture here?
The dollars will be allocated to the left side.
All the money will be on the left side?
I believe all the money will be on the left side. I haven't heard, Senator, that there was any set aside for an acquisition and revitalization program.
Okay.
And Senator, this is Hanna. In 2016, the bond, it was a $50 million bond. $10 million was dedicated to blight, and that's what went on the right side, and the $40 million for affordable housing went to the left side.
Okay. So Hanna, just a question on the timing, and then I always want to comment on the BHDDH side. So I understand and appreciate the time it takes to go through and get all the funding and get all of the permitting. Understand all that. But it looks, based on what you've articulated, that we've broken this up into tranches of funding to go do certain things. Based on the need, the urgent need, any reason we don't do all this at once?
So Mike and Carol, you may want to tag team this with me, but I think that, so in BHRI, we ended up, the last time around, I mean, we were massively oversubscribed, meaning we had lots more requests for funding than we could actually fulfill. And that was, so there, when we were reviewing the applications, you're really trying to assess who's ready to go right now and who's...
No, sorry. Let me just be more specific and direct so we can, I won't take too much of yours or the committee's time. Based on what you talked about, money that was appropriated a number of years ago, we're just doing some things now with it. As opposed to, if it was appropriated 2 years ago, any reason it wasn't done within n number of months after being appropriated.
So the 2016 bond was fully obligated as of, for over a year, right? So we've been unable to approve new projects for over a year because we had obligated all of the funds. Okay. And I think what Carol and Mike and all of us are working very hard to do is to make it make these funds, help deploy these funds as quickly as possible. So,
okay, so don't take anything. Don't take anything I'm saying as being disrespectful to what you're doing. I know you're trying to do your best. If there's things where we can help, let us know. Because the longer it takes for us to achieve the goal of building homes for Rhode Island with the money that's going to come out, assume the voters vote on March 2nd, we'd like to get started the next day. So if you could just be thinking about that.
We completely agree.
Okay.
We completely agree.
If you go back to slide 28 real quick. I think it's 28. Yes. So I know you talked about it in Ashton Village. We talked about it at a hearing we had last, I don't remember when the last hearing was. I believe Carol was there. Christine might have been there. It's important that we account for individuals with intellectual development disabilities in the housing bond and what we go forward with. I don't know what the number is. I don't know the number of units they are. And I know there's some work going on by some projects that you're about to award for a couple, 3 or 4 units, which is great because every unit that we do for that is better for that person, number one. It also satisfies the American Disabilities Act and Olmstead decision about ensuring people are in the right place at the right time. But it's also the case where it's also cheaper too. It's nothing better than putting somebody in the right setting and having it a less costly expense for the state as well. It's a double win across the board. So I'd ask, and I will ask again once the money becomes available, assume it's voted on, what are we doing for folks with intellectual development disabilities? And I see that you have here BH, DDH, et cetera. We need to ensure we don't lose sight of those folks as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
If you wouldn't mind, I just want to respond to Senator DiPalma, just briefly to let you know that one of the evolutions of our program regulations with the third bond issuance was we established an actual 30% priority of the funding would be used to support projects specifically serving folks with special needs, including those that are disabled that would meet your definition. So that'd be something we'll talk about as we go through the policies for any continuing bond, whether or not that was sufficient, should be increased, or how we can best serve that.
Michael, thank you, and excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome, Senator. Senator Acosta, followed by Senator Mack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank Hanna for one of the most keeping it real presentations that we've had so far of saying, hey, look, this is a problem that we had before. We really need to address it. And you know, I have a little bit of a question along the lines of what Senator DiPalma was saying, but it seems to be that we have some idea of what the problem is, and we're making efforts at some solutions, but we don't have a long-term plan. And there's an appetite for this, right? People keep approving these bonds. It's likely that the bond that's coming up is going to get approved as well. So if, you know, all things equal, some kind of ceteris paribus kind of situation, if we know the demand that we have now, how long would it take at the current pace to meet that demand? And how much money would it take? Because we keep, you know, adding a little bit more. Here's 50 mil, 25, 50, another 65, and it's not solving it. So what it speaks to me is that we need a 25-year plan, a 20-year plan to address the housing crisis here, and then we have something to measure ourselves instead of hitting these intervals. And so would it be possible to get data on, here's what the demand is right now, at the current pace, here's how long it's going to take us to meet that demand. And that way we can start kind of thinking through how we legislate, how we allocate. So even if we got the 65 this year plus an 8 million a year for the next 10, 15 years, how close would that get us to satisfying the problems that we have?
Thank you, Senator Acosta, for your question, because I think that is exactly the kind of thinking that we are going to have to deploy. Would it be possible to go 2 slides forward to slide 30? I want to point out a couple of things that we were trying to do that I think it may not answer the quantitative question you posed, which is a very good one, but I think it'll show you some of the things that we've been thinking about when we proposed last year in the budget that was derailed by COVID, as many things have been. The first was to deploy a dedicated, reliable, you don't have to debate it, it's in the budget every single year, it just, you know, it goes on and on. Funding housing production, right? We have not had this. We are the only state in the region that doesn't have something like this. And having, I mean, it's like these, you saw Carol's slide about how complicated it is to build these projects, right? And to think, like, if you don't actually know whether or not the funding will be available to unlock those projects, it's very difficult for developers to put in that level of cost, not just to mention effort, right, to get those projects ready to go. So I think so that piece really speaks to making it more predictable. And $8 million a year, I mean, you said last year, it's good, but there's more that needs to be done. So that's one piece. The last piece, strengthening housing governance, I also just want to mention that was really about trying to set a table for some of these meaty strategic conversations that you're alluding to. And I think housing, it touches every single, so many different facets of life for Rhode Islanders, the economy, transportation. I mean, you can keep going on and on and on. And it is a conversation that we very much were trying to wrap our heads around. The last thing I'll say is that partnering with cities and towns, it is hard to even begin to conceive how many conversations we have about how challenging it is to build in Rhode Island. And it's almost all of these problems are not totally unique to Rhode Island, right? Like it's hard to build in general, but working with cities and towns to try to find ways to make housing be viewed as an asset and not necessarily solely a liability, and investing in our communities and creating opportunities for people to live. So I think there are multiple lines of attack that we're trying to get at, and this is not saying these are all of the solutions, but we do think we need to do everything we can.
Thank you. Senator Mack, followed by Senator Coleman.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I really do appreciate y'all answering a lot of the questions about homelessness and people who are housing insecure. So that is a problem that existed before the pandemic. And shout out to my friend Acosta for stealing all of my questions. But I do have a couple more. $8 million, like you said, does not sound like enough. If there was a wish list, what is the amount of money that Rhode Island needs to dedicate to a dedicated funding stream? And by some of my research that I've done, we are by 2025, Rhode Island needs to have created 30,000 new units. And right now we're not on pace to meet those 30,000 units per year in order to meet our housing stock. What is the amount of dedicated revenue we would need to meet that housing need? And how many units per year do we need to keep up with demand from y'all's research?
Great question. I have to confess that I'd like to go back and retake a look at some of these numbers now that, like, coming out of COVID, because I think that some of the thinking that we were putting in, we knew that, when we set the $8 million goal, there was a $25 million bond, and we were aiming, let's try to double what we're investing every year. And the $65 million bond is major opportunity. But again, and as you're all saying, and we're all agreeing, we've got to deploy this quickly, because it's a resource that, if you spread it out over time, it won't be this kind of difference that we would be aiming for. So if you look the effort, I'd love to follow back up with some more of the thinking on the math of production and the units, and what does a difference look like. So.
Senator Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you as well for a really great presentation. Could you go back to the slide that has the different funding components for a project? I don't remember which one that was.
Very last slide.
Do you know which slide I'm talking about?
Very last one, I believe.
The one right before that. Yes, right. Okay, so one of the things that stands out to me is that this is incredibly cumbersome. It's a lot of different funding sources. And I was just thinking back when I was in college, they gave me a financial aid package that had like a bunch of different stuff in it, but it was administered by one body. And I guess I'm wondering, like, A, does this just look confusing to me because I don't work in this field and it's really not as hard as it looks? Or B, like, is there a way to systematize all of the funding so that there's some sort of like single portal that could help reduce some of the administrative stuff that goes into patching together all of this money? You know, I'm certainly willing to believe that it's not a problem if that's what you all tell me, but to me this looks like a lot of moving little bits of money around to try to make a whole, and I'm curious about what the effect of that is on these projects and on the speed of these projects.
You're definitely onto something. Go ahead, Carol, sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. It is complicated, and it involves a tremendous amount of work and applications to various funding entities. And we realize that, so we have been working over the past year to come up with a one-stop application for the resources that Rhode Island Housing controls, that, you know, the state Office of Housing and Community Development and HRC controls, and also with our community partners, the funds that they have. There will always be resources that developers will apply for, like the historic tax credits that we don't have in Rhode Island in control, and like the affordable housing program that is administered by the Federal Home Loan Bank. There will always be applications that we can't account for in a single one-stop app, but that's our goal, Senator, and we're working very hard to make that happen through a technology platform at Rhode Island Housing.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from any senator? With that, on behalf of the Housing and Finance Committee, we sincerely thank you for preparing this presentation and spending almost a little over 2 hours explaining it. Both committees look forward to working with you when the picture becomes a little bit more brighter. We spent $9 million in 10 months of federal money. We were awarded a late Christmas gift of $200 million. I see that as a good problem to have, and we certainly look forward to working with you. With that, motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Seconded.
I'll second that.
Second.
I want to thank both committees. Thank you very much for the questions. I'm sure the panel certainly appreciated it. And everybody have a great night and a great week.